So before that, I want to tell you about our event, what we are going to have this week. For this week, we are going to have Bali Bungkus, 2 Bali Bungkus, and 1 think tank for tomorrow as well. So for think tank, we have a girl who made this business in wild gym environment. So she needs more feedback from you guys. So if you're interested, please feel free to come. And then for tomorrow, we also have Bali Bungkus in Facebook advertising. So if you want to know more about it and how can you like make a profit from your Facebook advertising, please feel free to come to our Bali Bungkus next week, tomorrow, sorry. And also on Friday, we're going to have Play Up Bali, where they're gonna be like 4 games developers and they're gonna exhibit their games. So if you want to try and just like get around with other people as well and maybe get some giving them some feedback about their games, so feel free to come to this Friday. And for today, we have Daniel who's gonna tell you more about the history of digital nomads. He's gonna tell you about what it looks like from the beginning until the current stage right now. So please welcome Daniel.
Hi everyone. It's so nice to be back in Ubud and in Ubud. I was here in July and probably coming again. So I'm a in and out member. I'm a senior lecturer in the Australian system, which would correspond to roughly the associate professor in the US or the Professor W2 if somebody is German in here. So essentially I'm an academic. Okay, so I study digital nomading now for some time. So actually I try to learn from you. So all of what's in the history of digital nomading came actually, most of it came from you guys, people actually doing digital nomading, or there's a lot of, we spoke about that just now, there's a lot of gray zone what actually is a digital nomad. And I'm studying it from various perspectives. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but the main focus today is essentially on a paper that I'm writing on the history of digital nomading. It actually traces much further back than I think most people realize. And this is the topic of today, so most of the presentation going to be on that. I just thought I'd give you a bit of background, both about myself and the institution. I think every presentation is a little bit also knowing about the presenter. So I'm working at UNSW Sydney. Sydney is here, if you haven't been. Fantastic place. We have our big competitor, Melbourne, down there. It's, in my opinion, a friendly competition. The Australians don't think so. As you can tell from my accent, I'm German, so I'm not Australian, so I haven't grown into this battle between Melbourne and Sydney. The capital of Australia is Canberra, which sits right in the middle between Melbourne and Sydney, and was chosen, I have been told precisely of that reason, because you couldn't give the capital to any of the two. Main industry in Australia, is still mining. That might go away with China now doing a lot of digging, Mongolian border. The next big thing in Australia, according to Deloitte, are agribusiness, gas, international education, tourism, and wealth management. So I would be in that space, in international education. It's a public sector, university sector in the in Australia, in contrast to the US, so many good schools are private. We have a group of 8, which some call the Australian Ivy League, and I'm in one of the 2 universities of that which are in Sydney. We have the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales, Sydney, which is essentially the city and the state university. That's where I am. Relatively new university, pretty big, at least by US and European standards. So I think that's even outdated. I think it's more close to 60,000 students now, plus 15,000 staff, plus an affiliated hospital with 20,000. So it's a huge operation, and they're finally building a tram from the center of town to us, which I think should have been done about that time, yeah, when they founded it. yeah, reasonably good in the international rankings, somewhere around the 50 to 100 mark. That probably doesn't mean a lot to you guys. For universities, this is extremely important. They all go by these ranking tables. I'm particular in the business school, so it's a full university with all faculties. I'm in the business school, and then the business school itself is 20,000+ people, so it's actually almost the size of a university in itself. So we have within the business school further schools, and I'm particular in the School of Information Systems and Technology Management, which also means that I take a slightly different perspective on digital nomading than most of my colleagues, which have now started to research on digital nomading, because they're usually anthropologists, sociologists, and they're looking more through the lens of, you know, what makes people want to go to Bali. And that's, of course, an important part of the story. But I think there's also certainly a technology and business perspective to the phenomenon. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. My own background, I did a master's and PhD degree at the University of Cologne, had a startup before the first .com bust. Essentially, we were not really affected, but we were in the pre-IPO space, and there were not much pre-IPOs after it bursted, so essentially our market went away. So in a sense, we were affected. I did consulting a bit before my PhD. Then I was actually reading here on Bali the Wired article on crowdsourcing. I don't know whether anybody knows that, but that was the first article where the first, you know, write-up where somebody proposed the term crowdsourcing. I said, I want to work on that. And then I enrolled in a PhD degree to work on that topic. Became a lecturer and now senior lecturer at UNSW. Spent substantial time overseas, including during my PhD, half a year at University of St Andrews in the UK, and 1.5 years at SASIN, that's the business school of Chulalongkorn in Bangkok. And then for my sabbatical 2 years ago, I went to Copenhagen and to NYU Stern in New York. I do a couple of academic things, like editing for a couple of academic journals. I got an early career award, which was sort of nice, and also equally nice, the student voted me their favorite lecturer of the business school, which is also that I'm not only popular with my academic colleagues, but also with my students, which I do appreciate. I do have some street credibility in terms of talking about digital nomading. I did a world trip between my master and a PhD. That's why I read the article here on Bali. Doing that, I was essentially a tech nomad, writing a travel blog. Eventually, I was approached by Deutsche Telekom for sponsorship, so they actually paid me to write that travel blog. It's still online. The Flash animation is gone that I made. I think I don't know what's either the provider is not there or it's not supported in my browser anymore. I actually took a screenshot yesterday for you to show. There I was in Hampi in India, fantastic place as well. And then when I did my PhD, also for many of the reasons that makes you come here, I decided to do it in Bangkok. I mean, my degree is from Germany, but I decided to go to Bangkok because I found it more beautiful, more interesting, certainly. My lousy PhD scholarship would take me much further in Bangkok, all of these reasons. And then I was still having some clients for which I would do remote work, so I did a bit of web development. So in a certain sense, I was doing sort of digital nomading. Actually 2006, that's probably relatively early even. Now I'm essentially coming back to the topic from more like an observer perspective, because I do definitely 9 to 5. Even the professorship gives you a certain amount of freedom in terms of what you study. You don't need to go to the office every day, but you definitely have a desk and an office and an employer and so forth. All right.
Digital nomad to fix your website.
Yeah. I probably skipped that. That will be mostly interested for colleagues. This is a couple of the papers that I have published over the last year or so. We ran a special issue on openness, which is essentially a general approach to how you use technologies, which would certainly include things like freelancing, but also open source development, open content like Wikipedia, essentially anything that's created in an open contribution, open call way rather than in a hierarchy. We look at organizations, corporates using that under terms like open strategy and internal crowdsourcing. So they use this kind of strategies internally. And this is a paper on crowdsourcing for a better world, where we looked at 2 cases where we had crowd-funded and also involving the crowd actively in community projects. One was a community center in Africa, another was a research project in Australia, and they were essentially running out of options how to do that, how to finance that, and then turned to crowdsourcing, crowdfunding to make that happen. That happened successfully, so I studied these cases to understand what is happening here, why does it work in a crowdfunded way, why does it not work in a door knock, bake sale, offline mode. If you want to follow my research, some of these journals are unfortunately closed access, so without having access to a university library, you can't get them. But everything that I can put up on ResearchGate, which is a social community, which has become pretty big for academics, you can essentially follow me there. I try to put all of my research up on there. This is the paper on crowdsourcing for a better world. So essentially, this is the theoretical model that we eventually developed, where you essentially have a set of technology affordances, what technology can do for you, can do for humans, which relate to the motivations that people have to volunteer their time or to contribute money to the project. And we identified a range of these affordances which would not be present in offline charity, including that you want to build up credibility in that space because you have, for example, your own startup in a similar space. You want to be visible, which would not be given in offline charity. Other people say, well, it's also a bit of, there's an image component to it. I share that on my timeline. Other people only noticed it online because it's so much easier to search and find and to go to the websites and look specifically for your particular interest charity project, which, a door knock is more random. So there's a couple of things which just work much better with technology. Now for this research study, I'm studying digital nomading as a phenomenon. Things that I'm interested in is the history of digital nomad. Every phenomenon, even it seems to be new, actually, of course, has roots that go much longer and much deeper back, and I'm trying to unpack them to find out what these roots are. Then I'm interested in essentially your sort of personal journeys, what makes people do and mobilize technology and business models in a particular way to make the way that you want to live a reality. Use of technologies and the interrelation between technologies and work, what people sometimes now call future of work, digital work, and the different structures and logics that people apply and the different ways in how one does things work. Okay? So if you are a digital nomad, want to become a digital nomad, work with digital nomads, including people that run co-working spaces or otherwise feel connected to this community, which pretty much will apply to most or everybody in this room, please do get in touch with me. I'm here today and probably tomorrow. So if you want to have an interview with me and be part of the study, I would be more than happy to have you involved. Yeah. Yes.
Just how define digital nomad? Does anyone working remotely with a computer is digital nomad? Or
that comes exactly to that's why this is my next slide, because I was anticipating the question, what is digital nomading? I looked up all the definitions that are around. Some are okay. Eventually, I defined my own definition. Let me know what you feel about it. So people that work remotely using digital technologies, that would be the digital component, which would certainly include other digital workers. So if you do telecommuting, telework, probably even in a wider sense, everybody who completely does their job on a laptop, graphic designers even in an office position, okay? So, so there's definitely the digital work component. That's the digital of digital nomads. And then you have the nomadic components. And there are other types of nomadic behavior. Of course, classical nomads, I'm going to talk about them in a second. Travelers, excuse the double L. Any kind of non-digital worker on the go. There are people repairing Ferraris, you know, there's all kinds of non-digital work. And for me, the core of digital nomading is where the digital work component and the living overseas traveling component come together. So it would be in a narrow sense this, and then of course there is a gray zone in which, you know, how long do you have to be nomadic? Is it sufficient to just live as an expat overseas, or do you actually have to change locations in certain frequency? So you could certainly, you know, move these categories, but essentially I think that's why the term has, you know, stuck, because I think there is this digital and this nomadic component to it. Yes?
A lot of people I've spoken to identify with digital nomads if they have clients, opposed to location independent if you have a full-time employer.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought.
Yeah, so I think I think the question is, do you really need to be living location independent, or do you just need to set up your life in a way that you could potentially do it? I think I like to use a slightly narrower definition. Otherwise, there's no problem in framing it more widely, but then you have a substantial overlap with telecommuting and telework, which is really a phenomenon since 20 years. And of course, there are shared you know, topics around telework and digital nomading, but this whole thing, you know, there's a Bitcoin talk later on. There's a co-working space like Ubud. So there are certain things which are very specific for this combination, you know, being in a place that you would usually only go for holidays. Some of you don't really have a home base anymore, or only temporary a home base and move around. So I think there is something distinct about this phenomenon. I try to keep the distinctness. Otherwise, of course, there is a lot of, you know, gray zones between just being a teleworker and having a fixed contract even as an employee, but working from home, taking care of your children. Yes, that would be definitely digital work. It would not qualify for me as digital nomading. I was asked about the numbers. The only thing I can say, probably several hundred thousands at the moment. Again, depending, of course, on the definition that you use. So if you include teleworkers, that's much larger, because that's a substantial share of the workforce by now. If you specifically look at this narrower definition of digital nomading, I have heard the number 500,000, I have heard 100,000, but nobody has actually shown me the research behind that. So the only thing I can give you is essentially the range of estimates that I have that I got from subject matter experts. Everybody who has researched that, who is a digital nomad, how many people are in Facebook groups, how many people are in co-working spaces, what's the share of people in co-working spaces that identify as digital nomading. So in a sense, we don't know, but it is definitely 6 figures, okay? So history. Nomading is of course not new. So nomading has essentially, that used to be the way that we all lived for 90% of the time that we had humans. People were nomadic, called hunter-gatherers. Only then, when they invented the idea of growing crops locally, we actually changed into a settler format. So nomads is actually quite a normal way of living historically. It's essentially moving from place to place, living and working on the move as a way of life. UNESCO estimates are that we have 30 to 40 million of these traditional nomads left in the world. So they're being crowded out by other structures, such as the nation states, where the idea of ownership of land doesn't really work with the way of moving about. We had, you know, the drama in Rwanda with Hutu and Tutsi, where they essentially were virtually trying to kill each other. So there is certainly a competition, both in terms of historical dominant model as well as in how you actually organize a society, between settlers and nomads. And then we have, of course, migrants, which are still a distinct category. So this is essentially a one-off movement. So if somebody just moves from the US to Bangkok and takes a normal job there, that would be a migrant, but it would not be a digital or otherwise nomad to me. Okay, so that's a bit of the history of nomadic behavior. If somebody is interested in really the deep, deep history of nomading, that would be the seminal book on the topic, Nomads and the Outside World. As I already said, 90% of human history we were nomadic. We still have hunter-gatherer folks, but are very, very few. The San people in sub-Saharan Africa are one example. Then we have pastoral nomads, which is the vast majority of the 30 to 40 million which still exist. They include the Maasai, the Bedouins, the Tuareg, the Sami people, the Mongols, and so forth. They are essentially usually moving herds of animals across places. And then we have nomads which are moving around based on a particular craft or trade, which would be the Roma gypsies even. I don't like that term particularly. Another look very, very long term back is the relation of the place where you live versus the place where you work. So in the hunter-gatherer periods, we were essentially living and working nomadically. We were always on the go. Then with the invention of farming, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, we lived and worked in one place suddenly. Then with the industrialization, with the invention of large machinery that needed to be physically in one place, we came to invent the workplace that didn't really exist as a category before. So essentially then you would live in one location which is close to your workplace. So you live in one location fixed and work in another location also fixed. And then what people have called the digital revolution, information age. Most people live settled, but many of them, if they have knowledge work to do, and actually there's a range of things that you can do remotely. You could work remotely, or, and that's the category where we are, you live nomadically and you work nomadically. So essentially we're back here. Okay, so this is sort of the way of how the location and the location of living and work has changed over time. Now, early visions of the digital nomad, I was always hearing this digital nomad book as the first book on the topic. That's not quite accurate. Actually, Marshall McLuhan has predicted that in the 1960s under the term of global village. Of course, when he wrote that, that seemed to be outrageous because we didn't have the internet, not even early forms of it. There was just nothing of that sort. But now, he was a flamboyant person, I was hearing. So he appeared in a Woody Allen movie, if you remember that scene where a show-off guy from Columbia University is trying to impress his date and talks about McLuhan and gets everything wrong, but sounds like, very convincing with it. And Woody Allen can't stand it anymore and takes him and says, what are you talking about? And then the other guy said, I'm giving a lecture at Columbia, what you're talking about. And then Woody Allen puts Marshall McLuhan into the frame and said, well, you don't believe me? I have Marshall McLuhan right here. And he says, young man, you have no idea about my work. So this is sometimes what you feel as an academic if people are misquoting old books and obviously haven't actually read or understood them. So Marshall McLuhan got a lot of things wrong, but also got a lot of things right, including the idea that we would work remotely from a place like Ubud over electricity. So of course there was no concept of the internet, so he was talking about the electricity lines, and of course in a certain sense that's true. He's now largely credited with predicting the emergence of the internet long before there was a technical possibility to do so. Alvin Toffler, a futurist who is mostly famous for this book, The Third Wave, which is after agriculture and industrialization, the information age. He predicted that we will work in electronic cottages, so essentially working from home. That was his vision. So there are some predictions of digital nomading or working remotely before we actually had any of the technologies in place. And then, of course, in the 90s, we did have the internet, and then a couple of people, probably earlier than others, figured out what you could do with the internet and how it will impact on how people live and how business and society work. That's Hagel and Armstrong, McKinsey partner. He was essentially talking about online business models and building social networks and communities, 10 years before Facebook existed. Then, of course, the Makimoto Manor book on manners, on the digital nomad, which is the, gives the name to the phenomenon right now. They were pretty accurate in terms of how they predicted that this would work for certain. They were talking about executives essentially doing everything on their mobile phone. That's the closest probably that we have. Another good prediction was the Malone-Laubacher paper in Harvard Business Review predicting the rise of an e-lens economy. In turn, this inspired the actual e-lens marketplace. So the founders read this paper and said, well, we need to make that happen. That's awesome. So a year after this article was published, they actually launched e-lens and then started the whole freelancing, crowdsourcing, remote work marketplace. And then in sociology, you have Castells, who has a trilogy on the information age and its impacts on economy, society, and culture. Now I'm going to the actual history of the digital nomad in a narrower sense. I found it useful. It doesn't always work quite as neatly as I want, partly because we have a merging of frames and contexts, but I try to classify things into technology trends, business trends, and travel trends. Some of that will not work out quite neatly, precisely because digital nomading is all of that, right? Okay, 1970s. So the first predecessor of the internet, ARPANET, was launched in 71. And we have, of course, the invention of the personal computer. That's the very first one that was ever built. It then became popular with the IBM PC, and even more popular when other companies reverse engineered the only part that was legally protected, the BIOS of the IBM PC, and could produce IBM compatible PCs, which massively increased the market size and drove down prices. So that was very bad for IBM, but very good for us. So PC and first network technologies came up. There was actually predictions on telecommuting and flex place working already in the 70s. So these are different visions from this book, Niels, 1973, where they essentially formulate a trade-off between costs for travel versus costs for telecommunications, and then suggested different models of how you could have the best of both worlds. Okay. So essentially, that was a very, very early conceptualization of telecommuting. The whole idea is that instead of you physically commuting to the office, you're commuting electronically to the office. Yeah, that's why we have that term. And that was also what people usually did. They would have terminal computers rather than, they didn't have laptops, of course, so they would use terminals which then connected to the mainframe computer at the fixed location. In terms of traveling, you can go even further back than that. So there's arguments that the whole desire to travel goes back to colonial times and a sort of cultural heritage from that we desire the Orient because we once possessed it and don't do it any longer. There's of course a range of books that on the road or Dharma bumps, they certainly triggered this desire, massively increased by the Beatles going to India in 1968. Then this journey to India, this mystic East became a thing. And there was a large amount of hippies, colorful Volkswagen buses traveling this route from London, Istanbul, through Iran and Afghanistan to India and Nepal, and sometimes on to Bangkok. Okay. Some of those people doing this trip from London to Melbourne actually is this Melbourne couple here, Maureen and Tony Wheeler, and they found that there's a resource missing for people doing the hippie trail. And they wrote a book about it through Asia on the cheap, which became the first publication of their publishing house, Lonely Planet. Yeah, and Lonely Planet was then, of course, a massive trigger for a backpacking culture. Yeah. So both the desire to go to the east in some way, as well as the actual emergence of resources. like the guidebooks, but also just like cheap guest houses, and you know, all the infrastructure that you needed to actually do that started to emerge. Yes?
Something maybe you get to it, but it kind of keeps coming up to me a few times. But what I always find interesting about the digital nomads is not sort of this what, but sort of this why are they doing it? What's the motivation behind everything? And so, and when you look at it even more so, like you say that, you know, the travel aspect goes back even further to colonial times. I genuinely believe that. And like, you know, I was having a discussion this morning with a guy upstairs about trips to the Antarctic and Shackleton's adventures. I mean, I think there is this concept of, you know, that we, you know, what is the desire of humankind to be going and searching? And so then just extrapolating this, and maybe you get to, is that I don't know if there's any distinction between digital nomads and the rest of all humanity, except they just act upon it. But I think all people seek knowledge. And I think that is why, weirdly enough, like here, one of the founders of Ubud calls it digital nomadism, spelled with a K, rather than N-O-M-A-D-S, it's K-N-O-M-A-D-S, it's seeking knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyways, I mean, maybe you get into the motivational aspects behind it a little bit later, but I think that is to me, that is what is so interesting and kind of fascinating, is how these things trisect or dissect or...
Yeah, so to this point, I'm not going into that. I have a separate paper on the value systems and institutional logics, it's called, that people draw upon. Yes, I would say there is certainly a desire. You could possibly argue that it's something that we have suppressed between hunter-gatherer, because maybe to settle was always because it works easier, but not because that's what we desire to do. That being said, of course, there is differences in character. I think some people, you know, people that rank high on the openness scale, they tend to go, you know, there's this 5 big personality traits. They seem to be engaging in this kind of risky behavior more easily than other people, or feel more comfortable in doing it. And there seems to be also some level of cultural contingency to it, in a sense of that, for example, Chinese and Japanese have only now really started to do individual traveling, while it's much more common in Western societies. Where this ultimately leads, I don't know. I think there might be a fundamental desire for exploration and for continuation of learning. I would say in actuality, it's culturally moderated. Yeah, so there is certainly both in terms of microstructure. So are you a conservative person, or are you a liberal person? Are you an open person or a closed person? Are you a Chinese or an American? So I think that both is true. So I think there's a universal human desire, but I think it plays out differently depending on the different cultures. Yeah, I do have a paper on that, but that's not in the history here. That was the first digital nomad, John Roberts. He essentially took one of the first laptops, battery, solar panel, and a bicycle, and did his writing job while he was in the early 80s. I think he started 1983, and then was riding around the US, working on the go, was writing with his laptop wherever he had electricity, and then uploading his work to his secretary in his, I think, Baltimore, I'm not sure, his home base, using dial-up pre-internet connections. So he was really the first one that would, I mean, it sounds funny to do it on a bicycle, yeah, so it's a very particular way, but he was certainly the first who fully embraced and thought, well, if I pick that technology and this technology and get it all together, this is possible. Why not doing it? So he had his bicycle made, and he was traveling in that way for a number of years. So in a certain sense, he was the first person that I know of who fully lived and worked remotely for some time. Other important trends were in the 1980s, first companies embracing telework and telecommuting at that time, usually, for example, placing call center agents onto private lines at home rather than having them come into the office. In terms of technology, the most important inventions from, again, this comes out of a large range of sources and people that I have spoke to, including people who have been among the first doing that. TCP/IP protocol, and then of course universities connecting their networks to what would actually become the internet or internets. We had early internets in Germany. It was BTX, for example. There was pre-internet electronic networks. Then certainly the invention of the laptop and the invention of the mobile or satellite phone were important contributions to make that possible, what we have today. In terms of travel, so backpacking became a major trend. Even the Shah went out of power in '79, I believe. The Afghanistan war, Russian-Afghanistan war started at that time. So the hippie trail essentially went away because you couldn't take the overland route anymore. So some people would fly into Goa, but a lot of people now took rather the banana pancake trail in Southeast Asia or the Gringo Trail in South America, from Peru to essentially Colombia. So essentially there was a massive increase in backpacking. The Khao San Road, which many of you will know in Bangkok, emerged around that time. So backpacking became a more mainstream phenomenon. 1990s, again, there is no single date for when you can say the internet started, but I think, you know, the middle of the road claim would be that Tim Berners-Lee work at CERN and, you know, having HTTP, HTML and the World Wide Web, that we can say this is roughly when we have the internet in today's form. They had some sort of a browser, but the first proper browser in the sense of how we understand the category of software today would be Mosaic, and 1 year later Netscape Navigators. Both are essentially gone. Even Netscape Navigator still lives in Firefox today. And of course Wi-Fi was another important invention. And then of course through the 90s increasingly laptops became smaller, more powerful batteries, had Wi-Fi. And I remember that I was writing my master's thesis in the end of the 90s with a G4 MacBook. So, and that was in a library. So essentially at that time we had laptops with Wi-Fi. We had this technology available. We had internet. Business side. And now, of course, it starts to get iffy to distinguish between basic technologies and the business models that are using these technologies. But I try to keep the separation. So we had electronic business and electronic commerce coming up as a category. Things like eBay and Amazon launched. Amazon affiliates, so affiliate programs became important income source for people who want to make money on the internet. Then, of course, we had Alta Vista and other things before, but specifically Yahoo and Google massively improved the way that we can find things on the web. So people say that the killer app, both on the internet as well as on the smartphone, is actually search. PayPal and online banking are important because they allow us to do all the transactions online. So the necessity to be close to some sort of physical brick and mortar bank went away because you could do it online. Then Elance, as I already mentioned, launched in 1999, and then Odesk and Topcoder and Freelancer.com and a lot of other of these marketplaces went online. Webcam was invented, and as I said, by the end of the 1990s, both mobile phones and laptops, even they were invented in the 80s, now they became really a category that everybody either used or was at least aware of. And then we also had the first internet cafe, which is not really co-working, but you know, it's sort of a predecessor in the same line of you have a physical space which is organized around the internet. Another important factor was for fostering the general way of going on the road was certainly the reduction in flight costs over time. So this is the costs in today's dollar of kilometers traveled or miles traveled. So you see how it massively decreased in the 1990s. So that was certainly something which also helped people that wanted to move, because that a lot of people couldn't go to India anymore when Iran was taking over was simply they didn't take the Volkswagen bus because it was so much fun. It was just too incredibly expensive to go via airplane. And that essentially went away in the 1990s. People started to use technology on their travels. There was a New York Times article on tech nomads, which are essentially travelers using technology to report on their travel, not necessarily to work. Nobody had really figured that yet out, but they were writing blogs, they were meeting up, so they formed a community and so forth. Then the 2000s, then in a certain sense the phenomenon took off, even maybe not in numbers, but in awareness that this is possible. I think certainly the 4-hour workweek publication was critical in 2007 in making, I think for a lot of people this was really, oh wow, this is possible. Yeah, so I think the 4-hour work week, with all its problems and faults, I think it was rejected from 26 publishers before he eventually got it in with one, and then of course became a New York Times bestseller. I think 1.5+ million copies now sold. It's not particularly well written, but he was really talking about digital nomading, running a location-independent business, spending more time living and traveling, and all of these things. I think that's a very important stepping stone. I see it as inspirational because what I hear in a lot of accounts is that really coming across a particular idea that could be in a book, that could be on a blog post, or that could be in a personal conversation, then strikes a chord. You realize you have this desire, but you don't know how to act on it or how to act it out. And then suddenly you see a model and say, well, this guy did it, I can do it. Okay, so I think that's why I call this like inspirational sparks, which included first traveler social media hits, like Where the Hell is Matt, and travel blogs, including my own, even it was in German. But I suddenly realized there's hundreds of people traveling with me, which was sort of funny. And then somebody said, well, because hundreds of people are traveling with you, we're going to pay you for your travel blog. Again, for me, this was always conceptualized, because I didn't have another conception at that time, as a return trip. Yeah, so it was not a one-way ticket and then working remotely, but I had always in mind coming back. So I discontinued that. But other people, of course, there's a whole travel blogger community, and the first conference on travel blogging was end of the 2000s. So there was people starting to see this as a way of running a business. Technology, of course, Web 2.0 and social media are born in the 2000s. So let's only talk about those which are still around. We had Friendster and a couple of other things which didn't really take off, and MySpace. But Flickr, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are certainly the big names. And they are also very, very strongly enabling techniques. Yes, you do a lot of other stuff on Facebook, but you also go to communities, get advice, and reduce loneliness, because it gives you a permanent way of being connected to the life of friends, which is also a very, very human desire to be a social animal, to be connected. And I think these technologies, and Skype is another one, enables you to be connected to them without necessarily being physically in the same place. So in that sense, I think social media was really critically important. Google AdSense for more the commercial aspect, Skype and Dropbox, again, very basic technologies that we, not necessarily whether we use Google Hangouts or Skype is not the question, but to invent the category. There's this documentary about the founders of Dropbox. They had massive problems finding a VC for their startup because they couldn't really explain the category. They said, we have already USB sticks. Why would you want something? So it's very, very difficult, and I find that always with my students, very difficult to explain a technology where the category doesn't yet exist. It doesn't need to be Dropbox, but to have a cloud, to have an online repository, which essentially means anything that you have, any file, you don't need disks, you don't need a hard disk drive, anything is on the internet is on the cloud. And then you have the machine that makes you go to the workplace. You have it everywhere where you can plug into the internet. So the machine is suddenly everywhere, which makes the necessity to have a workplace go away. So building block for building block, all the things, if you think about an office, POC, fixed line phone, folder with files, all of that goes away and essentially reduces to the mobile phone and the laptop. Speaking of phones, of course, iPhone, and not much later than after iOS, I think half a year later, Android, Google came on board. So, this was really the first full internet embracing, easy to use device. I think the importance of internet focused smartphones is also very important. In terms of businesses, organizational models, we had the very, very first co-working spaces. There was one open only a couple of hours per week in Spiral Muse in San Francisco for half a year or a year. You might know better. We have people from the Bay Area here. That changed to another co-working space a year later, but I think they called it co-working space in Spiral Muse. So in a certain sense, they were the first, or he was the first. Also, Ansgar Oberholz here, that's in Berlin, in the Café Oberholz, which was a cafe, but it was always providing constant internet, and people came there to work as if it was a co-working space. So you could say that this has been the first emergence of co-working spaces, and realizing that it's not so much fun to work out of your bedroom, but it's maybe much nicer to work in a place. Of course, it was a long way to go to come to something like Ubud, but that's where the roots are. I was hearing, but I'm not putting that on the slides because I have to verify that since then the number of co-working spaces has approximately doubled every year. I don't know whether you know the more precise numbers on that, but it's certainly, you know, very, very high growth. Technomedia.com was launched as the sort of first community, and cultural shift in business in certain types of jobs. A home office, at least some days, like Fridays, becomes more and more common, especially if you do development and technology work. That was probably the first sector where this started to become acceptable. I think this is still ongoing. There's still places which do not accept a home office at all. So even in my area, in Australia, to work from home is no problem at all. As a professor, I was hearing from my friends in Thailand that would be unthinkable. You have to come in, even that means 2 hours traffic in the morning, 2 hours traffic to come back. It's not yet that so far. Again, cultural differences, there's organizational culture. So there are many things which hold things back until today, but certainly telework and home office became a thing. Very interesting work on how the power in the travel industry has been reconfigured through social ratings instead of, you know, waiting for the inspector from the official rating agency to come in and figure out who he or she is, and then trying to make the stay as awesome as possible for that particular person. Now you essentially, well, the internet is your rater, right? There's 800 reviews. Now it has entirely reconfigured the travel industry. And then websites like Couchsurfing and Airbnb came online, giving you alternative ways of finding accommodation, then also usually much cheaper in the case of Couchsurfing, or at least somewhat cheaper and more diverse and less in a tourist bubble framing through Airbnb. Another important book was Vagabonding in 2003. So that was on the travel front. And then essentially we reach today. So digital nomading is there. That was a report I was seeing when I was in Thailand. I didn't really understand it. I do speak a bit of Thai, but not at that speed. Yeah, but essentially, yeah, digital nomading is something which is suddenly recognized as a phenomenon. I think if you look at Google Trends, you can actually see how the use of the term has spiked since 2015. So I was actually giving my very first talk based on interviews that I did 2010, 2011 with remote IT workers in Bangkok. And it was really like striking me when I was talking to my Thai English teacher, and she was talking about her boyfriend being Canadian and working out of Bangkok or Koh Lanta. And I said, I would like to speak to your boyfriend. Yeah. So I realized that I was doing that with my remote work. And so I studied this under the term, for the lack of a good term, I called it the beach lancers here, because I spoke to a lot of people on the Thai islands. I think digital nomads has now been widely accepted as, you know, some focal point. Even it's, you know, don't call me a hipster. A lot of people say I'm not a digital nomad. I'm, you know, my own model, which is fair enough. But I think also it's a fair framing of the phenomenon. We have the wireless generation and one-way tickets, 2 documentaries about the phenomenon. I think this one is in post-production now. Of course, press coverage, including, I believe, BBC, Guardian, and other Forbes and other mainstream Huffington Post mainstream outlets, there might be an element of even hype to it, particularly because Instagram and this kind of technologies make it so visible now. And I think there might be a bit of, a lot of people are probably at the moment considering this, whether this is the natural growth path or whether we see some Bitcoinish, little bit hype, then it goes a bit down, comes back up. I don't know. I think the trend in general is definitely up. Yeah, I think now in terms of recognizing this phenomenon, digital nomad has been, as I said, the first guy is, 1983. The book is 1997. Even Ferris' $1 million bestseller is 2007, also 10 years ago. But I think it has really been taken off the last about 2-3 years, I would say, as such a mainstream phenomenon. Mainstream, I mean, it's still niche from the outside, but considering that such things like where we are today didn't exist 10 years ago, it is now a substantial phenomenon. And of course, and I'm going to talk to that in a minute, it's part of a larger transformation of work, digital transformation of work, future of work, digital work. People have used different terminology for that, but that might be a very specific form of a larger transformation where 9 to 5 and potentially some organizations or types of industries or organizations in those industries may go away and may be replaced with either non-commercial, in the sense of platform, purely peer-to-peer businesses, or like light-level, smaller platform businesses of the type like Uber, Airbnb, which, yeah, they're still in a sense mediating it, but they are much smaller and they don't really have employees, but just coordinating, at least that's what they frame it as, coordinating freelancers and free agents to meet one another. Of course, we have now a series of conferences starting. So technology or physical resources, so you have an increase in internet and mobile data speeds with a decrease in costs. So now you can essentially work, if you have a good mobile contract, 4G, I could probably get with a data package which really costs nothing around here. I could probably just work from wherever I have my mobile phone. I think the last important social media type was Instagram. And then, of course, specifically digital nomad platforms such as Nomadlist, Hashtag Nomads, Dynamic Cycle, Tropical MBA, Facebook groups, and a range of others. Then digital nomading-centric co-working spaces, including this place here, Hubot, Cohub, and all of the other names. So there is, of course, an industry emerging. And I also think that even we haven't really figured it out what really to do with the blockchain. I actually never really saw Bitcoin as an investment form. I really always used it just as a payment form. Yeah, so good thing I bought a couple of Bitcoins in the go. But I think the investment form, I'm not entirely sure because we don't really know where the fair value is. There is no system to essentially, there is no model to predict that in any way. So I think 90% is market psychology, actually. So there is not even an approximate true value. There is just not such a thing as a true value. But I think in general, yes, we need a digital currency. It is also institution buildings against the nation state, because essentially what's happening here, that we have some sort of transnational digital nation kind of construct, and piece for piece job markets, currencies, and all the other institutions which were the mainstay of the nation state as an institution are rebuilt in the digital space. And I see cryptocurrencies particularly important because now money, in this case, is out of the hand of control of the nation state. Business-oriented developments, I think a couple of books are important, including Osterwalder's business model generation. He actually was also working in my field in information systems, and he had the model in 2005 in an academic journal paper. Unfortunately, nobody reads those, but when he brought it out 5 years later as a nicely illustrated book, then it immediately took off, and now we have our students in the business school work with a business model canvas. Huge impact. Same as lean startup method, which is Reese and a couple of other people. I think also crowdfunding, starting in 2009, really becoming a household thing with the big success of Kickstarter around the 2012 mark. I think that has shown that there are alternative ways of funding products, funding ventures, and you're not necessarily bound to venture capitalists, to their locations, and so forth. Odesk and Elance merged to Upwork, and we had the first series of conferences, including CU Asia and DNX, which I think are also very important to, create exchange and community in that space. And then in travel, not so much in the sense of completely new development happened, but I think, this co-workation, or however you want to call it, so, more actively combining travel and work, or co-giving, I think these are developments that I would place here. Future developments, I see a lot of outrageous predictions. It's very, very difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future, as the saying goes. So I would treat everything that you read about future predictions with extreme caution, even that comes from major industry sources or academics. It's an incredibly dynamic and non-predictable space. So my personal take is that I see digital nomading as part of a larger transformation of work as such. We had these different stages of work, and we are now very strongly moving into this information age work form. Finally, I think now we have all these historical puzzle pieces together. Yeah, there is nothing anymore which keeps us with our current, there's really nothing which would keep you to an office if you do knowledge work. We have replaced everything with digital means. As I mentioned, there's a sort of clash between institutions, because the nation states, of course, based on citizenship, based on money, based on taxes, that's what holds society together. Now, I don't have slides on that, but you might be aware that the nation state is also a very recent invention. So most of the time, of course, we didn't have nation states. In Germany, I think only like slightly over 100 years that we have a nation state in Germany. Before it was feudalistic systems, peace and parcel. So, the nation state is, now the world is cut into nation state, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in that way. And I think what we see here is a sort of, it's not a physical location, it's a digital location which is transnational, and we are slowly building the work forms, the financial forms, we have e-passports, we have digital embassies. So there's a sort of digital nation, that's my quote term for it, emerging, which builds its own institutions. Why? Because it's possible. Certainly a level of self-actualization that has for most knowledge workers not be possible previously. So, and I think that's essentially, if you come back to your question, I think there's a strong need for exploration and self-actualization. And then there are physical constraints, economic constraints, which are holding a large amount of people back if you're not born rich, to say it very bluntly. And even then you might not value it, but I think now is I think a particularly exciting time, because we can see the two models, we can see the differences, and we have a reference and departure point. Once, remote work and all of that is, just the new normal, just the way that you do things, you might not value it as much as I hope a lot of you do, that this is a great opportunity. It's also probably one of the last times that we really do have this unique different cultures in different places, because that's globalization, that will go away. And so I think it's an interesting time. Also, of course, there are ecological factors. So probably if we are not coming up with substantial new technologies, which we don't yet have in our hands, it might not be a good idea that everybody is buzzing around with airplanes the whole time and burning kerosene. So, there is also, we're certainly living beyond our means at the moment. So we're living at the expenses of future generations. So it's in a certain sense, an exciting and an insane time. So unique combination of factors come together. What are the next disruptive technologies and business models? If I continue this through my academic career, what will I put on the next slide? And that's the big unknown, the unknown unknowns of Rumsfeld. So we don't know what this is going to be. Yeah. So is it blockchain, AI, robotics, or some sort of technology, or maybe political? There seems to be, a substantial populist movement in politics going on. So maybe there is, counter movements. We don't know what the next, if somebody would told me we have Donald Trump at the US president 2 years ago, I would thought that's like a joke. Yeah. But it can also affect local communities. So, politics in Indonesia are made in Jakarta, not in Ubud. So there is a risk that nation states are fighting back. I think I'm running out of time. And I'm also interested in what does it actually mean for the local communities. Okay. So, so as I said, there's an exciting trend going on. Where this exactly will go, we don't know. I think anything is purely speculative at the moment. I think it's a growing area. I'm skipping that just for lack of time. These are essentially the kinds of theories that have been used, including Castell's information age. I mentioned that before. Lifestyle migration theory, which also looks at why retirees would move to the coast, to Florida. And sociology beyond societies that talks about mobility. So the idea is that people and physical objects and social structures become mobile. And I'm trying to bring in a more interdisciplinary perspective into this research, not only quote unquote looking at sociological and anthropological constructs, but really also at the material technologies and the particular business models that make all of that possible. This study, as I said, I'm doing interviews, so if one of you finds it interesting to be involved in that study, please do contact me. I'm around this afternoon, so we could do it straight away, or we exchange contacts and do it remotely via Skype. If you want to be part of the study, I would probably need about 1 hour of your time. It's anonymized. All clients and personal names will be taken out, so it does not reveal anything. I'm happy to share my research with all the participants for feedback and just to have it. You might find this stuff interesting. And there is so I'm not selling any kind of product, so it's non-commercial, it's purely academic in both directions. Also, if anybody else, like other academics and journalists, are working on that, I also hope to get people on board for more interdisciplinary research, so I would also encourage those to contact me. And that's pretty much it, what I had about the history of digital nomads so far. This is pretty much work in progress, so that's what I have pieced together so far. I'm really more than happy to hear my major misunderstandings and oversights in this storyline. So if you think something is misrepresented, underrepresented, something is missing, please do share that with me. Yeah. All right, thank you for now.